Hello, and welcome to the show where I try and make a little sense out of this stunning and brave new world we all live in by talking to a series of expert witnesses and inviting them to share their truth. It's important in life to be in touch with your feelings, but it's also crucial to be able to back those feelings up with facts. And so the purpose of this show is to attempt to push past purely personal or political driven positions, distinguish fact from fiction and fake news headlines, and hopefully contribute to wider debates about sometimes sensitive subjects by having a good old-fashioned, open and honest adult chat. And today I continue to talk sense not sensibility with the esteemed writer and researcher William Collins, author of the recently published book The Empathy Gap: Male Disadvantages and the Mechanisms of Their Neglect. In this episode we discuss the men's rights movement and the different approaches taken by people within it, the state-funded infrastructure that currently exists for promoting gender equality, and the moral responsibility placed on public servants tasked with championing equal rights for all. We also discuss the pros and cons of establishing a government minister for men. And to begin with, I asked William how he would respond to a common criticism levelled at men's rights activists, which suggests that they don't do anything practical to help men, such as build men's shelters, and in reality spend most of their time simply slagging off feminists.
Yeah, we've faced this criticism many times, and the thing is, the one on men's shelters, there's a history of people trying to do that.
Yeah,
and I don't want to get into that issue.
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah. It's a long story. Yeah.
But those are live issues, and historically, the attempt has been made to enhance DV shelters for men in this country and others. Stymied generally by lack of money, principally. In fact, you talked about the men's movement splitting, but we'd have to first be unified before we split.
Okay.
It's a movement, but it's not really got any organisation as such. So no one speaks for the MRN.
Yeah.
I mean, no one does. I can't do it. And, even Paul Elam or Mike Buchanan wouldn't dream of speaking for the whole movement. They're just individuals. So there are genuine criticisms. The one thing that bugs me most is when people exaggerate the stats.
Okay.
You need to do that. My perception of things is that we don't have much going for us as a movement. We have no organisation. We have no money. We have no influence in any centres of power or influence. And we have a very bad public image. The public in general think we're vile and reprehensible. Yeah. So as a movement, that's pretty shit, isn't it?
It's not great.
The only thing we've got going for us, as I see it, is the truth.
Yeah.
Trying to speak truth to an entrenched power which is getting more untruthful every day. That's the one thing we've got. So it pisses me off beyond belief when people that are supposed to be on our side think they're helping by exaggerating. You don't need to bloody exaggerate. All you've got to do is tell the unvarnished truth. Right?
Yes.
The statistics are not always as massively one way as you might want to make out.
Yeah.
But the overall picture is clear. Present the overall picture. Honestly, that's what I've been trying to do. So it does annoy me when people gift the opposition. When you're inaccurate on your stats, you gift the opposition.
Yeah.
Opening. And the way the game is rigged against us is that we've got to be 100% right all the time, right? The opposition can talk mountain loads of crap and get away with it. We've got to be 100% right all the time. That's the position. Don't deviate from it, because the truth is all we've got. Yeah.
That's definitely my philosophy. That's definitely the approach that I've tried to adopt. But I do have a lot of respect, and I suppose that's something I'm trying to probe at, for people that say, well, they're gonna get something. They're gonna grab something and smear you with it, whatever it is. So therefore, some people go almost in a different direction, and sort of every movement needs its radicals as well as its, kind of more straight-laced characters.
Yeah, the civil rights movement needed Malcolm X as well as Martin Luther King. That's what people normally say, and I think there's truth in that. And you can understand the way you were referring to people that have a media voice, or at least have a sympathetic hearing with the media, being very cautious about what they say, and they are. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I'm thinking of a few specific people who are doing good things, but they are careful what they say. They wouldn't label themselves as MRAs. They are careful never to mention feminism. They just talk about men's issues.
Yeah.
And I understand where they're coming from, and I do know for a fact that some of those who I wouldn't mention the names, I know over a private conversation, them just every bit as outspoken as me or Mike Buchanan, but you won't hear that when there's a camera on them, and that's right and proper. That's how politics are done. I mean, it's politesse, isn't it?
Yes. One of the things I do struggle with is, people use the term the Overton window, or the metaphor of the Overton window, and that, kind of clearly it does shift over time. And it is absolutely quite often radicals who have a dramatic impact shifting that. So I suppose sometimes I do think it's important to know when to actually talk about certain things. And I thought that the Hope Not Hate report was one of those times. It was quite shocking. They drew a distinction. They stopped I think they drew a line between the good and the bad people that talk about male inequalities as well. But essentially they were smearing everybody with the same brush by saying, well, some people talk about men's rights, and they had a conference, and, oh, by the way, they're all alt-right fascists without any evidence. So do you think it is sometimes fair to criticize people for not putting their head above the parapet slightly more?
Well, of course, there's talking about an iceberg analogy. It's the iceberg analogy isn't extreme enough. I mean, how many people are quietly sympathetic but would be reticent, even in private conversation, admitting it, and certainly not going to go forward on social media and say hard-hitting things. That's a vast number of people in that position, and you can't criticize people because the downside is being sacked. This is not an invention. This is what happens. It's not only the high-profile cases. It's all the ones you don't hear about that I leave it out because they've not expressed the right view, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse as the diversity agenda in the workplace gets rolled out ever more aggressively. There's going to be one hell of a lot of resentment building up.
And I think, that kind of feeds into your thing about identity politics and intolerance. If people think these things in private, how much of a responsibility, I suppose, actually, how much of a moral responsibility, particularly people who, for example, work in the public sector or are, political leaders, how much moral responsibility or duty should they have to speak out about the fact that everybody has the same human rights, the same equal rights?
Well, that was my thought process when I started blogging, because I've never been interested in politics. I've never had any interest really in politics. If you'd asked me, at least before I started getting into gender politics, where I was in a sort of left-right line, I wouldn't have known what to say because I was that uninterested. So I've only gender politics was my first dabble in politics, and I suppose to some extent I've got more interested in general politics as a result of that. But my view when I was totally apathetic was always that it's okay to be apathetic, except that if you see a totalitarian system arising in your country, then you have a moral obligation to oppose it. I always recognise that. That was my sort of excuse, for being an apathetic person. But then I did see that, unfortunately, and so I felt I did have to do something about it. So it's absolutely moral obligation that I blog about these things. There's no personal benefit, and I'm not one of the burnt men. I mean, a lot of men in the movement is because they've been mangled by the family courts, or they've suffered abuse, or they've been homeless, or so. Yeah, a lot of. I think most men in the movement have been affected personally, and that's what's brought them to the red pill. But I'm an exception. I've come at it purely from the academic, factual direction, and just thinking, well, it's wrong. What's happening is just wrong. Which is, I suppose, I mean, they're not. I think women in the movement tend to be more of that type. They've not been stung; they just see it's wrong. Whereas men in the movement tend to have been damaged by it.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree, and I'd also say I would view my kind of journey as similar, but watching kind of some of the trends, and particularly the hard data, the statistics about how it's going for young men, and both in terms of this kind of cultural trend of sort of these Twitter mobs, etc., and they kind of this PC policing of language, which must be horrific if you're kind of a young man. But particularly the stats around education, stats around suicide, stats so once you start looking at those stats, it's particularly why aren't more people kind of particularly people whose job is to there's an entire industry around equality by this stage. Surely kind of my perception would have been that there would have been quite a lot of people who were there for the right reasons and therefore would speak up.
There are some, but they tend to get sidelined eventually. They tend to be just single voices that speak up for a while and then they go because they move on somewhere else. I mean, look at Mary Kernock-Cook, the head of UCAS. She was quite outspoken, and she still is actually, because she's a member of the Coalition for Men and Boys, but she's now retired, and I can't remember the name of the woman that's taken over UCAS, but she's not the same animal. She's not going to speak up about it. In fact, I think UCAS now probably deliberately obscure the disadvantage to males in university entrance, whereas Mary Kernock-Cook actually made it explicit. So this happens. There are individuals that speak up, but then the narrative reasserts itself. It's the brushing water uphill and it'll come back again thing.
No, I think that's a good analogy about the reality. Pushing water uphill. I genuinely struggle with that concept of if people are embracing equality and embracing the concept of universal human rights, why would people not be standing on this issue and talking about this issue? Because it's clearly at the forefront of gender equality in terms of issues. If you logically look at, I think Mike Buchanan puts it very well when he challenges people generally, but feminists particularly, to name an area where women are legally, or where the state intervenes to disadvantage women.
He never gets an answer. I've never known him get an answer.
Well, they usually go straight to equal pay for some reason, which is ridiculous. As we've talked about, just kind of even to the heart of government, the seat of government, men don't have their feet under the table in terms of gender equality issues. It's quite remarkable. I wanted to ask you about the infrastructure that exists around, I suppose, the kind of the policing and pushing of the narrative around gender equality, and kind of, deciding what are the key issues to prioritize, etc. And I'm talking specifically in terms of kind of the state, whether that's kind of local councils or whether that's kind of government level. The infrastructure around gender equality is so, I mean, the table is so loaded. It's quite dramatic. I mean, if you look at the Equalities Office, men are not within their purview. They're literally,
Yeah.
it's not in their business plan.
Yeah.
Now, I personally think that will change. That cannot stay the same. There's the utter hypocrisy of it. And my concern is kind of when it shifts, similar to International Men's Day, it just becomes consumed within the feminist philosophy of how to help men. So have you any thoughts about that, about kind of whether we're kind of reaching a point where it might be important to maybe try and get a bit more organized, maybe have the ambition of having a minister for men, for example?
Well, of course, Swaino Pai is pushing Minister for Men like
Yes.
for what it's worth. And a Minister for Men was one of J4MB's manifesto issues in 2015. So it's out there as an idea, and I think there are some people in the mainstream that have backed the idea. I can't see it happening, but I mean, I think Swain's got a good point because it forms a good talking point.
Yeah.
Why not have a minister for men? Tell me why they shouldn't, because here's a list of issues that he could address. I mean, it can't happen, because how could you have a minister for women and a minister for men in the cabinet? I mean,
yeah, well, I think that's, I mean, a lot of people would just find that ridiculous for a start, and political correctness go mad, and etc. But I suppose kind of one of the things I'm kind of sort of trying to get at is that originally I would have thought a minister for men is a ridiculous idea, because it is kind of creating that feminism, men's rights axis almost, as opposed to actually kind of embracing the concept of human rights, and the fact that kind of identity politics is not the be all and end all of everything. But the thing that sort of would have swayed my view is that I think we are eventually going to get a minister for men, in the sense that the minister for women will become the minister for men.
Well, that's what should happen. If men's issues are going to be represented at cabinet level, it'll have to be via a gender-neutral minister that's genuinely looking after equalities. So it'll be an equalities minister rather than a women and equalities minister.
Yes. Absolutely.
I don't see any problem with that. Ask the average 6-year-old whether they see a problem.
But I suppose one of my concerns is, much like the kind of feminists embracing International Men's Day so they can talk about toxic masculinity all day. Is that eventually I even had this out with Jo Swinson, she's Liberal Democrat, because she used to be in the minister, she was the Minister for Women or whatever, and the point that, well, how can you justify having an equalities office that doesn't actually represent half of the country?
Well, it's the same with the EHRC, of course. I mean, they're the same. It's their mission is equality, but they have the usual biased agenda.
I'm just fascinated by the infrastructure, because I think with the example of the domestic violence sector, kind of the only way you're going to see any dramatic shift is when the state infrastructure stops so dramatically discriminating against men. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know which comes first, though, the chicken and the egg here, whether the popular narrative has to shift first to drive what happens in Parliament and in government. I think that is the way around, because our politicians are not leaders, are they? They're followers in general.
Yeah.
So I think it probably has to come that way around. I think it has to come from a popular movement. But you see, the thing you were getting at there was that even if men's issues are ostensibly taken on board, it will be with the usual. We've got to fix men, because men have got to fix themselves because they're broken, and this is their problem. All their problems are in some way their own fault because of masculinity, and so they've got to fix them. We'll help them fix themselves, but they've got to fix. What they won't ever accept is that the state as a whole and society as a whole can impact adversely on men.
Yeah,
and you see, all this is the ancient gender scripts, the ancient gender norms, in another guise, because men are powerful and agentic, and women are not agentic, and they're vulnerable and have to be protected. Right? So, if men have problems, the problems have to come from men, because they can't come from anywhere else. Because who else but the powerful can adversely impact on the powerful? This is the irony of this whole business, that the people that are clinging most tenaciously to the old gendered mindset and the old gendered norms are the axis that pretend to be progressive, feminist and forward looking, but they're actually still being driven by the old perceptions of gender in a new form. And that's because it's advantageous to them.
Yeah.
Because feminism works by victimology, by having the focus of concern on women. And that works because of the ancient gender mindset that they are non-agentic and vulnerable and need protection. So the feminism is this amazing contradiction. At one hand, they're pretending to say, well, women are strong and capable and powerful and independent.
Yeah.
Oh, but we also we need all these privileges and special provisions.
Yeah.
They legitimize it by saying, well, men are wicked. Men have all the power and the privilege, and they're also vile and wicked. But all this actually is legitimized by the ancient perception of the genders. And whereas the men's movement, which has an image of being reactionary, and we want to turn the clock back to the 1950s.
Yeah.
It's always the 1950s, isn't it? It's never 1939 or never 1914.
Yeah.
But it's not actually, the men's movement is not reactionary. I mean, because it's actually radical. The men's movement is the radical forefront of gender issues.
Yeah.
Because it actually stands for equality. And I believe that women are actually strong and independent.
Yeah.
And the weak and feeble bit is just a ruse.
Well, there's a thought to leave you with. By the way, for the uninitiated, in social cognition theory, agentic is a perspective that views people as proactive, self-organizing, self-reflecting, self-regulating, and not just as reactive organisms shaped by environmental forces or driven by inner impulses. In other words, it's a perspective that views people as capable of making choices that can impact on the world around them. Members of Parliament are clearly perceived to be people capable of making choices that can impact on the world around them, which is one reason why some people think that achieving 50% female representation in this area is such an important priority for champions of gender equality. But But then again, voters are also perceived to be people capable of making choices that impact on the world around them, most especially who gets to be their MP. And since 1928, the majority of people able to vote in every single general election in the United Kingdom have been female, which goes some way to suggesting that most people don't see the world in such simplistically binary terms as the girls against the boys. And that an MP wouldn't last very long if they only batted for the boys. Anyway, William has very kindly allowed me to include a sample reading from a section of his book about work, tax, pay and pensions that I thought was especially relevant to some of the themes explored in this episode. So hang around after the closing credits for that. And if you've hung around this far, why not do me a massive favour and like and share this episode? It really is the quickest and most effective way of showing your support for the Glass Blind Spot and helping to keep the show on the road. If you're feeling especially generous, you can now also help fund my work on Subscribestar, and in return for a $2 donation, you even get a little something in return. Or if you've got any thoughts about themes or people you'd like to see in future episodes, why not leave a comment below the line? We'll be hearing more from William in a little while, and in the next episode I have the great pleasure of talking sense not sensibility with a champion of gender equality who also happens to be very fast on their feet. So don't forget to look out for that. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and most importantly, don't forget, if you see an elephant,
can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.
This series of audio recordings features selected readings from my book The Empathy Gap, Male Disadvantages and the Mechanisms of Their Neglect. In this one I read from the final chapter a summary of the empathy gap in the case of work, pay, tax and pensions. It is remarkable that the pay gap is presented as a disadvantage to women, when the actual position on work, pay, tax and pensions is a transfer of money from men to women, consistent with ancient male provisioning and the pair bond. But the feminist objective is to make women independent of men, and the pay gap is their propaganda strategy to this end. Feminists may delight in presenting the gender pay gap as women doing the same work for less pay, but even they do not believe it. The full-time, all-age median pay rate gap is currently about 9% in favour of men, whilst the part-time median pay rate gap is about 5% in favour of women. The full-time gender pay rate gap for people under 40 years of age is essentially zero. The pay rate gap after age 40 is a product of women having children and or opting to work part-time. Everyone knows this, it's not contentious, but feminists want to increase women's power by increasing their presence in the workplace, especially at senior levels. The motivation for the pay gap propaganda is the drive to increase female power and make women financially independent of men. Over the UK as a whole, men work 52% more paid hours than women and work for more continuous years. 77% more men than women work full-time, whilst nearly 3 times more women than men work part-time, and average pay rates are higher for full-time workers regardless of sex. As a result, men earn 91% more than women and pay nearly 3 times more income tax than women, despite women being 47% of those employed. But women now spend more than men, or influence the spending of more money than men.
So there is a net flow of money from men to women for the purposes of spending. Please explain to me why the person working to earn the money is an oppressor, whilst the person spending more of the money is oppressed. It's not so, of course, but feminism presents it as such because the objective is to make women financially independent of men, and hence to have the freedom to eject men from the home. That is the true goal about which feminists are careful to avoid being forthright. Feminists endlessly claim that men do not pull their weight as regards housework, but surveys indicate that in terms of total work, paid work and housework, men do rather more work in total. Men and women also do similar amounts of unpaid voluntary work, nor is unpaid caring the sole province of women. In fact, men do 42% of unpaid caring, despite also doing 52% more paid working hours. A larger proportion of men over 65 are unpaid carers than women over 65. More men than women are in full-time employment, whilst also providing 50 hours or more of unpaid care per week. What would happen if men did what feminists appear to want? Simply decline to work so many paid hours in order to decrease their earnings and stay at home more. Would women pick up the slack and work longer hours? Does anyone really think so? Or would women simply tell men to get back to work? Who would ever do the dad jobs, the dirty and dangerous jobs, other than men? The 2012 British Social Attitudes Survey revealed that 69% of people believe that fathers should be the primary carer for the family, and 73% believed that fathers should work full-time. No respondents, to within rounding, thought the mother should be the primary carer, and only 9% thought that mum and dad should share the responsibility for earning equally. The Feminist Diversity Project, ostensibly to get equal numbers of men and women in all employment at all seniority levels, is disingenuous. They have no intention of agitating for such an outcome where women are in the majority. In any case, the project is preposterous as, taken literally, it would require an enormous proportion of people of both sexes to be forced into employment contrary to their wishes or ability. This is evident from the existing gender asymmetries in employment. 78% of occupations have an excess of one sex or the other exceeding 30%, and 41% of these involve an excess of female employees over male employees exceeding 30%. There has been no demonstration of any benefit from the proposed draconian policy of equalisation, and it's clear that it cannot happen. But the feminists are really interested only in using this overt policy as leverage to get more women into positions of influence. It's about power, not equality. In respect of pensions, how can one interpret the waspies who claim that the equalisation of the state pension age for the two sexes is inequality? Did they campaign against injustice for all those years when men's retirement age was 5 years later? In 1951, the mean life expectancy of males at birth was only 1 year greater than men's state retirement age, whilst for women it was 12 years greater. A man who lived to 65 to start drawing his state pension in 1970 could expect to live another 12 years. A woman who lived to 60 to start drawing her state pension in the same year could expect to live another 21 years, hence drawing her pension some 9 years longer than the man. Where were feminist complaints about inequality then? And now that the gold standard of pensions, the defined benefit pension, has all but disappeared from the private sector, but still prevails in the public sector, note that 2/3 of public sector staff who will benefit from this far superior pension are women, and that this will be funded from taxes, providing overwhelmingly by men. So we see that the ultimate fraudulence of the feminist drive for ostensible independence from men is that they never can be. Not so long as men to continue to do virtually all the dad jobs which are required to keep society functioning, and not so long as men continue to pump 3 times more tax revenue into the exchequer to pay for the female-dominated public sector and its pensions. In truth, what feminists really want is not independence from men, but rather not having to give anything back to men in return, not even an acknowledgement of reality.